Hey there. Okay, so we are in this book and we're talking about the chapter on with, where he talks about how God is with us. And I love that he covers this and it's in his outline for the book, and that he the way he talks about it is fun. There's so much more. This is one chapter where I feel like he could have done more, but I'm like, oh, you can't do everything in one book. And I love what he does talk about, and the one example I want to be sure to talk about is how he talks about the ruach of God, this idea of God's breath. And he just talks about how that was a way that the Hebrews talked about this idea that we're seeing now from science, but this idea that God is in everything. And he makes the point that it's not just this idea that, like, the Spirit of God is, like, over everything or, like, on another spiritual level, but just this idea that the ruach of God, like the breath of God, was physically sustaining and, like, in everything. Like, the life of God, the breath of God, was literally in all life, and sustained everything. That this is how God powers and energizes and sustains it all, which includes us. This is ruach is as intimate and personal as the breath you just took and the breath you're about to take. Yeah, that it was very real, and that there was no duality. It wasn't like a So let me read this. He says, the question then, the art, the task, the search, the challenge, the invitation is for you and me to become more and more the kind of people who are aware of the divine presence, attuned to the ruach, present to the depths of each and every moment, seeing God in more and more people, places, and events each and every day. He says, first, what our experiences of God do at the most primal level of consciousness is jolt us into the affirmation that whatever this is, it matters. He's talking about the power of now. He's talking about this moment. He's talking about making the mundane sacred. He says, this person, place, event, gesture, attitude, action, piece of art, parcel of land, heard, word, moment, it matters. And then he goes in and talks about weight and this word of kavod, that kavod, this Hebrew word for kavod, that had this it was a word they used for just figurative meaning, something of importance and significance, something that had weight, that really mattered. And he's like, kavod is what happens when you're trying to talk someone out of suicide and you keep insisting that his life matters. He says it's what happens when you meet up with someone who just shaved his head and you make a joke about it, and he tells you that it's because a friend of his is going through chemo and his shaved head is a sign of solidarity, and suddenly you're looking at that shiny head in a whole new way. He says that's kavod. Alright, this is good. He says, we live in a light world, one that bombards us from thousands of directions with advertisements and escape in every conceivable form, and television shows about people doing mindless things in elevators that play mind-numbing versions of songs we used to like before we heard them a million times. This noise in all its visual and psychic forms can numb us, making this day feel like it's without weight, because it's just like all the others as they all run together. But kavod is something else. He says when we're talking about God, we're talking about every single one of those moments, whether they're earth-shatteringly loud and large or infinitesimally small and whisper-like, mere slivers you inadvertently stumble upon. Moments when you are convinced, even if you've been burned and let down and betrayed countless times, you're convinced that cynicism does not have the last word, that life is not random or meaningless or empty, but that what you do and how you feel and what you say and where you go and what you make of this life you've been given, it matters. This realization that things matter lead us to a second particular response he talks about. What is that? Anyways, but that's one of the points that he makes in this chapter that I just love. And if you don't know that yet, like if you don't get chills, like I get chills when I read that. If you don't get that, if you don't know that and feel that yet, continue to seek and read and look and find and ask God to show you that. You know, you need to feel it in your bones. Like, oh, this matters. I matter. You matter. Everything that we do is holy and sacred. I think that's one of the great themes, you know, that I want to pull out from this book, that I want you to know, that I want us to get from this, is just to get rid of the duality and to integrate our lives, to embrace a holistic view. And that holism that says the sum is greater, because the sum is greater than, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I'm learning to walk this out, and it's powerful. And part of it is just letting go of judgment, that parts of your day are more sacred or more significant, and that maybe, you know, for me, it's easy to feel like doing one of these videos is more important than like cooking dinner or playing with my kids or having time with my husband. But all of those things are sacred in that they are a beautiful part of a holistic, healthy life, right? Like everything that you do matters, who you are matters, and we'll get into it when we read, talk about A Return to Love by Marianne Williamson, but I love the way she talks about, with everything that you do, the energy with which you do infuses it. Everything you do is infused by the energy with which you do it. And energy is spirit. So the spirit with which you do everything matters. And yeah, that's a theme we're just going to keep going with. Yeah, and as he's trying to, like, get this message across, he talks about how you ooh and ah over a tiny baby, and he's like, why do we do that? He's like, why do I hold up the baby's little hand and say, ooh, it's so small? And he says, I love this, he says, new life is deeply moving and mysterious because all life is deeply moving and mysterious. We have an intuitive awareness that everything is ultimately connected to everything else, and I believe that is one more clue to who it is we're talking about when we talk about God. Oh, I like this. Okay, I'm going to read this. He says, and this is kind of summarizing his different examples that he talked about in the chapter. But he says, how we eat is connected to how we care for the planet, which is connected to how we use our resources, which is connected to how many people in the world go to bed hungry every night, which is connected to how food is distributed, which is connected to the massive inequalities in our world between those who have and those who don't, which is connected to how our justice system treats people who use their power and position to make hundreds of millions of dollars while others struggle just to buy groceries, which is connected to how we treat those who don't have what we have, which is connected to the sanctity and holiness and mystery of our human life and their human life and his little human life, which is why we hold up that baby's hand and say to the parents, it's just so small. And I love this because this makes me think of what Marianne Williamson talks about, and she's talking about in her book, A Return to Love, she's summarizing principles from A Course in Miracles, which is this metaphysical text that was written in 1975 that I think is part of God's progressive revelation to humankind. And it's just, you read it, and it's just basic good spiritual principles, but in like a modern, fresh, different kind of way. And it's been really intriguing as I've been trying to kind of cautiously like wrap my head around it, but part of it just, you know, speaks to me. But then I'm seeing the themes as I'm reading these different people and hearing them talk. I see these common themes, and I just feel this truth emerging that like God wants to seep into our bones so that we can embrace, you know, our own power and presence as daughters of God. So the way that, you know, what I just read here, that makes me think of how she talks about how we're all one and we all come from love, and we all need to remember who we are, which is that we are love and we need to love each other, and that we're all connected. And he talks about the sanctity and holiness and mystery of human life and their human life, and how we're all human, and the way that we view who we are and the wholeness of us and the fact that we need to love people, then that needs to impact how we live our lives and how we affect, you know, change in society. Alright, so the point of this whole chapter is that God is with us. We are all involved, all of us, and it all matters and it's all connected. So he's building on, those earlier concepts that he talked about energy and involvement, how we can see with science that we affect things. He tells this really fun story about this guy speaking at a TED conference, and he says the audience had been asked if they consider themselves religious, and he said 2 to 3% raised their hands, but then he is kind of a social activist and gives this really moving proposal about how to do some really important societal justice kind of. He talks about injustice and racism, and at the end he talks about the moral arc of the universe is long and how it bends toward justice. And he says, Rob Bell is they stand and they applaud him and they raise a bunch of money for what he's doing, even though they claim to not be religious. And so he's when this guy talks about the moral arc of the universe, he's talking about history that is headed somewhere, something good, history that has a point to it. And Bell says, I believe that those smart, educated, accomplished, self-described as not very religious people stood and applauded because deep within every single one of us is the conviction that there is a point to this, that life has purpose, that when we die, the lights are not turned off and the show is not over. And he says the Greeks had a word for this sense of forward movement, purpose, and direction. They called it telos. That's why we love stories. They're loaded with telos. When we talk about God, we're talking about that sense that you have, however stifled, faint, or repressed it is, that hope is real, that things are headed somewhere, that something is something good. So kind of what he's doing in this book is he's giving us a bunch of different hooks to kind of hang our hope on and string together to build and kind of knit together the thread of a belief in God, right? He kind of is, he's trying to describe God in a more holistic, outside of Christianity, more of how do we talk about this? What does this mean? And so he's just that faith, that hope, that belief in something good, that desire to support the guy that's just clearly doing amazing work, that just resonates within us, that taking care of people and reversing the injustices in our society, that just resonates in us. We know that that's right. We know that's good. And he's just that is part of what we're talking about when we're talking about God. So it's interesting. He keeps using that phrase, and I'm yeah, he's talking about spirituality, but I think it's interesting how in today's world we have this history of religious tradition and then leaving that tradition, and American history, we just have this, and Western history, we just have this path that we've taken and we've ended up where we are. And I think we're all having this experience that it has been hard to talk about, and I like the fact that as a group, I think we're finally finding ways to talk about it. So he ends this with saying, I believe that you are already experiencing the presence of God within you countless ways every single day. That's why he talks about Ruach, and the very going onness of the universe, like electricity that powers the whole house and everything in it. And he talks about how everybody has faith in something. I'm going to read this part because it's totally I feel this way too. So he says, as a result, he does share in the book too about how he was a pastor and then he had this crisis of faith, kind of like I did, but very different because he was a pastor, active pastor at the time. But he had this crisis of faith where he went to this deep, dark place and then he came back out of it. So he's sharing too from a place of having rebuilt his faith to be his own and to be authentic and to account for all these things that don't fit in traditional Christianity, right? And he's trying to do that same thing of trying to how do I fit these pieces together? And he says, I move more slowly than I used to because I don't want to miss anything. I find more and more beauty and meaning in everyday average moments that I would have missed before. I need fewer answers because I see more. I find more people more fascinating than ever, because I'm more and more used to being surprised by the mystery that a human being is. I totally agree with that. That's happened to me too. I've discovered more and more events are less about the events themselves and more about me being open to whatever it is that's going on just below the surface. Totally true. Yeah, and I think that helps wrap it up to this idea of like God is with us. God is with us, so everything has more meaning than I used to realize that it does. Everything matters. Everything you do matters. The way that you do what you do matters. Everything on some cosmic divine level is equally significant and important, all the activities that you do. And when you really get this, you want to slow down so you don't miss things. You look at events differently. You see people and relationships and challenges and obstacles as spiritual assignments, like Marianne Williamson talks about. You see how that's basically just a way to say that God is in everything. Like God is literally the divine energy that is inside, like the pulsating energy that's tiny, that's like inside this desk and this book and this camera, like, and this computer. That energy that holds everything together, that is, you know, in everything, that is the divine source, the energy that is God. God is with us.